good morning to some of you. You're welcome to this webinar, which is a collaboration with many of our PWYP coalitions in East and Southern Africa. There are quite a number of hellos in the chat box, so you're all welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. So we've come together with a couple of our coalitions in East and Southern Africa to sort of have a discussion, to add our voice to this issue and the effects and the impact that it has had on our sectors and the work that we're doing within the extractive sector, whether it's mining, oil and gas. And so a couple of our coalition representatives will be sharing quite a bit from their work and also some of the issues that they've seen that have come as a result and affected, of course, the sectors in different contexts, but I'm sure there are things that our cats will get a chance to introduce themselves. And yes, so hopefully we can be done as soon as possible within at least 45 minutes or an hour, an hour and maybe 15 minutes. I know a couple of others who are on this webinar will be joining another webinar that has been organized by Oxfam. So yeah, so Fatma, I hand over to you. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nelly. Welcome, everyone. Good morning for some, good afternoon for others. Welcome to our webinars on the impact of COVID-19 on the extractive sector. Specifically, this webinar will be discussing the current status of the extractive sector in East and Southern Africa. We'll be discussing the potential impacts on tax revenues in the mining and gas sectors. Also, we'll be discussing the potential impact on communities, mining workers, and we'll be also reflecting on government response to minimize such impacts in the extractive sector. So we will focus the discussion on the experience of 4 countries, mainly Zambia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Tanzania. Recently, the SARWA released a research on the impact of COVID in Southern Africa. So we will host Veronica in this conversation to share with us the main findings of this report. Has guests also have out of Veronica from Sarwa, we will have Rachel Shagonja from Tanzania, Twalu Soni from Zambia, Mukasiri Sibanda from Zimbabwe, and Gad Benda from Uganda. So once we just have Rachel and Twalu now, and Veronica, we will start over with them. So we will have 80 minutes for our conversation. So we will give 40 minutes for the speakers, and the other remaining minutes will be discussing among each other. So you have opportunity, you will have opportunity to make a question. So you will raise your hands. There's a place there to click and raise your hand, and also we will be picking up some questions that you can type on the key on the chat. So please feel free from now to make questions if you have already. So we're gonna start with Rachel. She will be speaking about the Tanzania situation right now. Rachel is PWYP coordinator in Tanzania. So Rachel, the floor is yours. You have 10 rigorous minutes. Please unmute yourself and start speaking, please.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, PWYP, for hosting such a wonderful discussion. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, forever that we are. My name is Rachel Chagon. within. Yeah. So maybe just to take you through the extractive sector is that for quite some time now we have maintained a high economic growth over the last decade, and specifically with the mining sector, we are contributing almost to 4.8% of the GDP and 1% of the total government revenue. The sector is contributing almost 66% of EIT-related revenues. That is from the reconciliation of Tanzania EIT reports. And combined, both the tourism sector and the extractive sector in Tanzania, where we are having a contribution of almost 65% of the Tanzanian forex. And in overall, the extractive sector contributes almost to more than 6,000 communities across. That is for both large scale and small scale mining, plus the oil and gas, of nutrition is since the WHO declared this pandemic. Tanzania first case was announced in March 2020, whereby until now we have almost 500 cases that have been confirmed, with 21 deaths and 180 plus that have recovered. So we have major danger zones within the country, that is Dar es Salaam, Zanzibar, Arusha, and Mwanza. But there is limited unreported cases from the remote and rural areas of Tanzania. So the government response to the coronavirus disease of 2019 in Tanzania, first of all, there are no imposed lockdowns like any other country in the world, whereby most countries have gone under lockdown, but in Tanzania we have no lockdowns. There's been a strong push for social distancing and personal hygiene practices, whereby we have to wash hands and sanitize ourselves regularly. There has been also strong emphasis from the government on religious faith, that we have to put ourselves in a religious form so that we can fight against coronavirus disease. Also, the approach and promotion of the use of the traditional herbs, it's something that is strongly being said in Tanzania. Again, we have screening centers. For instance, in the mining sector, we have screening centers and quarantine areas that have been demarcated for corona cases. Specific with the extractive sector is that currently we are experiencing, like any other sector, the extractive sector has not been immune to this disease, and we expect that in Tanzania there will be a major hit in this specific sector. As I said, the contribution of the sector itself to the country's economy, it's huge, so it cannot be exceptional, and we are expecting so much hit on that. Currently, we're experiencing major layoffs on operations. For instance, a few weeks ago, companies such as the Williamson Diamonds communicated layoff of some of the operation. That means also cutting number of some workers that are going to be working in this operation. There has been also suspension, few suspension on the of operations. For instance, in the ASM sector, because we understand that the small-scale mining sector is a poverty-driven, and it's meant for livelihood. And most of the communities under the ASM sector, they always work hand to mouth. So they expect to go and work in the operations and provide food. But the fact that now this pandemic and the imposed lockdowns across the globe, some of the markets and buyers who are coming from the country to come and get some of these materials, that practice has been reduced. So we are seeing a scale down of buyers coming to Tanzania to buy some of, for instance, gemstones and other mineral resources. That's impacting, first of all, disrupting the social setting, the social life of getting a little income from the selling of these mineral resources. But also there's an increase of logistical disruption, as you can follow up probably some of the borders now, like Zambia, Zambia, Kenya, they are trying to ban trucks from Tanzania to go to some of these countries just for the risks of, for preventing risks of exposure. But also within the mining sectors, as I said before, is that there's little of inadequate unreported cases in Tanzania. So there's little information on how many cases within the SM sectors have been reported. And these are communities that are mostly scattered. So the fact that there's little inadequate awareness of the pandemic, there's still huge interaction within the mining sector in Tanzania, especially with the communities around small-scale mining operations. So higher risk, the higher rate of interaction increases risks of exposure, should there be more numbers increasing in the future. But at the same time, as I've already talked about the awareness issue, but we are lacking scientific findings, especially on the impact of coronavirus disease on the economic part of it, looking at the extractive sector as a case study. So no or limited scientific findings are available to try to assess to what extent coronavirus will greatly impact economies from the extractive sector. Looking at the supply and demand of the extractive sector, again, because of imposed lockdowns and other measures across the globe, there's been reduction of demand that has caused dramatic falls in the global prices in the period of March to April 2020. A few weeks ago, we're looking at prices of gold reducing to almost 50% of the previous amount. But these again have future impacts on anticipated revenues back to the to host countries. With the petroleum sector in Tanzania, for instance, there are no operations whatsoever that are happening right now. Most of the organizations, most of the companies within the petroleum sector have taken a work from home approach, and we're at a point of negotiating some of the contracts in the petroleum sector, especially for the LNG projects, but that has ceased to, that has been laid off because most of these companies are believing in not exposing people further, and they're not also believing in meeting physically. So the fact that there are no physical meetings, that means it has slowed down the process of negotiation. And the government has been able to put secure platforms has not initiated secure platforms to enable easy facilitation of these negotiations. But again, looking at the supply chain itself, because as I said before, the imposed global lockdowns reduced in market and overwhelmed storage facilities. Again, it will also impact the supply chain across the extractive sector value chain, whereby we have vendors who are supposed to be supplying in these extractive related areas, and that has been reduced. We have offices and organizations that have also cut down number of their staff just in order to cope up with the current situations whereby there is inadequate production within the sector. Looking at future tax and revenues projection from the extractive sector is that the profitability of the extractive sector is expected again to decline. Why? Because of imposed lockdowns, because there are no markets available right now. And that has implication on the current fiscal and external and real sectors. Because as I said, the extractive sector contributes almost 65% to the Tanzanian Forex. So because now we don't have much market out there, so that means the current fiscal policies and fiscal activities are going to be impacted by inadequate revenues that are supposed to be expected in the country. And that cuts across just not in the extractive sector, because again, the system of our government is that all the government revenues are collected under the government basket fund. So this overall government budget, again, is used to, it's being allocated to other sectors of the economy. For instance, we're using extractive related funds to support, let's say, implementation of other projects, like it's in the health sector. So the fact now this, we are anticipating a reduction in the future revenues has an impact in the entire sector, I mean the entire economy within the country. Again, as I said, in the petroleum sector, because in Tanzania there are no operation, but looking at the global scale is that, for instance, Equinor, they have closed most of their offices, but again, they have not shut down their operations. And the fact that at the global scale, there's still operation that has impacted the individual countries. And this does it, what does it mean? This means that you're going to overwhelm storage capacity. By the time that post-corona events arise, is that we were expecting.
I'm facing some challenges to listen to Rachel.
I think her network has gone off.
Yeah.
Rachel, can you hear us?
If she cannot proceed, we can move to our next guest.
We'll
Rachel?
come back maybe to finish. I can't hear her as well.
Okay, so we're gonna move to Twalu Soni from Zambia. Once our guest Rachel is not possible to remain in line, so once she's back, she will have opportunity to finish. She's back.
I'm back online.
Yes, please.
I'm back online, and I have just a few one slide I think left.
Okay.
Just allow me
2 minutes if you allow. Okay, let's move on, please. Thank you, Rachel, and welcome again.
Okay. So I was on the last point saying that. Thank you. There is fear for late submission of revenues opportunity to delay the payment.
Well, I think that definitely we will move to Mtwalu due to these network challenges. So Mtwalu, if you are in line, please. Rachel. Yes, Rachel.
No, Rachel's network, I think, is not very stable.
So okay, so she will have another opportunity to finish. So we will move really to Mtwalu. You have the flow, 10 minutes counting from now. Mtwalu Soni is the Publish What You Pay Zambia coordinator, and he's the representative of some of us at the Publish What You Pay EITI international boards. So Mtwalu, please, the floor is yours and it is open.
You can unmute Mtwalu if you're not.
Oh, well, Mtwalu, but it's not me who can do that. I think that the administrator of this can unmute him. Mtwalu, you can unmute yourself and start talking.
Yeah.
Mtwalu?
He had earlier said he has an issue with his network.
Okay,
so I don't know if
I see Mukasiri over there. So we can move to Mukasiri from Zimbabwe. Mukasiri, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much, Fatima. And
move on.
Yeah, I would like to greet everyone else who is participating in this conversation. My name is Mukasiri Sibanda with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. So I'm just going to give a brief on Zimbabwe in terms of the mining sector and the impact on COVID, and then specifically delve with the impact on the mining taxation issues. So in Zimbabwe, the mining sector is the pillar for economic recovery, growth, stabilization and growth. Zimbabwe's got a diversified mineral asset portfolio, over 40 minerals that are in Zimbabwe, and then export concentration is just limited to about 5 minerals. That is gold, platinum group of metals, chrome, gold, and chrome. So you can see from this diverse portfolio of assets that in terms of their performance due to the impact of COVID is quite varied. But before I go on, before I delve into that, it's important to recognize that just last year, 55 cents for every dollar that is earned from export earnings came from mining in Zimbabwe. That's how big the sector is. But because of lack of transparency and accountability, it is difficult to know what mining is contribution to the national pace, because we are not part of EITI. Over the past decade, we have struggled to join EITI, with the government repeatedly stating that they want to join EITI almost every year, but nothing coming to fruition. Having said that, it's important also to acknowledge that Zimbabwe took all the measures for social distancing, lockdown to prevent the spread of the novel corona virus. But mining, because it is the lifeblood of the economy, was exempted. And then in the second phase of the lockdown, they were allowed all to fully resume operations or to upscale their operations. Even artisanal and small-scale miners were also included in that bracket, because they contribute over 60% to the total gold deliveries that are coming to the country, to the government. Government has got a monopoly when it comes to buying, refining, and exporting of gold. And over the past 3 years, the mining gold production has been anchored on artisanal and small-scale mining. So for these reasons, it was seen fit that they should also be exempted. For the first time, the policy framework was not only slanted towards large-scale miners, but it also accommodated the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. But what are the issues of concern when it comes to taxation? The Chamber of Mines of Zimbabwe estimated that during the second quarter of the year, about over 400 million is going to be lost through output. And it's therefore important that one, they be exempted from paying pay as you earn. Number two, they be given a waiver, sort of a holiday, on payment of, or rather a waiver on payment of royalties in the mining sector, so that they sustain themselves. So these are some of the measures that have been put in place. But it is also important to note that under the so-called new dispensation that was ushered in after the change of government in November 2017, government was already on an overdrive to attract investments, giving all sorts of tax incentives that were quite overgenerous in the sector. So to this end, whilst we talk about domestic resource mobilization and especially donations, and the role of international financial institutions to support Zimbabwe to respond to COVID-19, government has been silent in terms of what the mining sector is supposed to contribute in terms of these efforts. The fiscal linkages have not been seen. So for now, that's all I can share. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We will come back to you with some questions. Now I will go to Mthwalo Msoni. Rachel, please be in mind.
Hi, Fatima, we lost you there.
I'm here. I said that now we will move to Mthwalo from Zambia. Rachel will come back afterwards to conclude her presentation.
I think Mutwalo has gone off, but
okay.
Maybe Rachel can finalize and as we get back
okay,
into
please, Rachel, come in, please, to conclude your presentation. Sorry for that. We understand what happened.
Thank you so much. I'll just take two minutes. So now we are looking, I was saying that I was trying to look at coronavirus disease vis-a-vis the national budget. So our government is sitting in Dodoma, that is the capital city of Tanzania. However, there is no stimulus budget to caution against economic impacts of coronavirus disease that is being discussed in the parliament. At the same time, we are questioning the spending of the Ministry of Health in terms of now looking at the transparency and accountability part of it. It's on how the government is spending on the funds that have been contributed by some of the extractive stakeholders, because we have observed that some of the large-scale mining companies in Tanzania have contributed adequate funds to support the government initiatives in mitigating coronavirus. But there is inadequate transparency and accountability in how that fund is being spent. Coronavirus vis-a-vis women in the Tanzanian part is that the informal sector ASM provides employment of hundreds and thousands of women across the country. In the case whereby we'll have total lockdown, there is highly a likelihood of many women, if not, will be forced to go to the lockdowns because they will have to take care of their families. So this has impact on the general livelihood and general life of the communities around Tanzania. So that is an overview and a small analysis, but looking at the recommendation is that moving forward is that it will be a good opportunity at the current situation if the government could review this CSR and local content related policies so that we can deal with the challenge of the supply, of the demand and the supply across the extractive sector value chain. But again, there's a need to have an international gender lens to design fiscal stimulus packages and social assistance programs achieve greater equality, opportunities, and social protection. There is likelihood whereby if there is total lockdown, most of these companies probably will lay off some of their staff, and one of the groups that will be highly impacted, that will be women. Again, at the policy level, we will demand and I recommend that the government could review and amend, for instance, workplace and employment-related laws to cater for this time whereby companies will be shutting down and some of the employees will be laid off. The issue is to support support employees not to be affected once there is total lockdown. They need to review CSR and local content guidelines to diverge interests, because prior related companies in Tanzania have been putting their funds to support, for instance, soccer related programs. But again, it would be an interest right now, the government, companies and other stakeholders to influence review of the guidelines in order to diverge an interest more to mitigate the risks of coronavirus. Again, the government through the Tanzanian Revenue Authority, they need to hello? They need to undertake financial modeling in order to estimate future revenues that will be expected to be generated from the extractive sector. And I said it before that the government also at the moment whereby there are lots of negotiations in revamping the mining sector, the extractive sector going on, there is need of the government to develop secure system that can accommodate the ongoing negotiations, especially in the oil and gas subsector. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I open the floor for Mtwalo Musoni. I see that he is back. Please, Ntwalo, you have 10 minutes and the floor is open. Just unmute yourself and start speaking. Ntwalo? Ntwalo? Well, I see some challenges from Ntwalo, so I will move now to Veronica from Sarwa to give us some takes about the report recently launched about the impact of COVID-19 in Southern Africa, extractive industry in Southern Africa. So Veronica, I give you 10 minutes for your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Fatima. Hello, colleagues. My name is Veronica Zano. I am with Southern Africa Resource Watch, which is a regional Pan-African organization that promotes the sustainable use and management of natural resources, particularly the extractive industries in Southern Africa. So recently we commissioned a research on the implications of COVID-19 on the SADC extractive industries, economies, and society in general. So what we're particularly looking at in terms of this research was to look at the measures that the SADC government have put in place in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as that the implication of some of these measures in terms of the economy. Secondly, we also wanted to ascertain what support have the mining companies provided to the government in the fight against the COVID-19. And thirdly, we also wanted to look at some of the impact that the COVID-19 has in terms of the government measures, particularly on the extractive industries itself. And lastly, we also then wanted to ascertain what have been the specific efforts by the mining companies to support and protect the local communities that are living within their operations. So basically from the research, it is quite apparent to note that there have been a mixed strategies employed by the different governments within the region to address the fight of COVID-19. And these range from total national lockdowns, partial lockdowns, and generally open strategies. I think Rachel from Tanzania shared with us how the approach has been quite a bit of a unique approach in terms with regards to the region. And what really influenced from our observations the lockdowns or the measures employed by the government was mainly influenced by South Africa as a key country within the trade and development of the SADC regional bloc in terms of trade and general supply, in terms of transport and logistical arrangements within the region. And as such, you'll find that in countries such as Zimbabwe, Lesotho, they also then opted to follow suit like this South African situation, then whereby they put a total lockdown on all activities except essential services. And importantly, the mining sector or the extractive industries in some of these countries that employed a national lockdown did not recognize the extractive industry as an essential sector, despite the major contributions that the sector has in terms of the economies of these countries. But you'll find that for countries such as Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, they opted to still remain open in the sense that they, whilst they might have put in measures to contain the situation of limiting movements, they did not really want to impose a total lockdown or put sound measures to stop operations of mining companies because of the key role that the extractive sector plays in these countries. And you'll find that for countries such as Namibia, there were situations of initially partial lockdowns, where initially it started in districts such as Erongo and Khomas, where there were restrictions, and in other parts of the Namibian country, mining operations still went on to operate. But in this, what was being employed by the Namibian government was that the mining companies needed to put in safety and health measures to protect those employees in regions where mining operations were still happening, though they were not part of the lockdown. You also find that in DRC, there was only partial lockdown for Kinshasa, which was the epicenter, we recognized as the epicenter of the national law of the COVID-19 when the pandemic started in the country. But however, there's been extension to other parts of the country. For example, in Katanga, whereby now the COVID-19 is spread to parts of that country, and which is a key mining province. And as such, this has had government to put in place mechanisms to stop to curb mining operations. So the mixed bags of importantly, what we also noted that for those countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia that had at some point suspended mining operations, they later on reflected on the importance of the sector and actually had to revise, despite the extensions of lockdowns, to open up the mining sector to play its critical role towards their economies, noting the importance of this sector towards towards the economies. But the initial lockdowns and that were employed by the SADC governments in countries is the ones that I mentioned have had really major, or they're likely to have greater implications to the economies and to the operations of mining companies and mining operations in these areas. And what we've seen is that because of the issues of lack of transport and flights being banned and generally distortion in terms of the international shipping arrangements, this will have major implications on the economies of the countries. And for example, the International Monetary Fund notes that the global growth could fall by 0.5% for the year 2020. And already we've seen a global economic decline. For example, we have had commodity slumps, for example, in the copper sector due to the increased copper supply. And with what has also been happening, we have noted that China is one of the biggest consumers, actually constituting 50% of Africa's purchasing 50% of Africa's minerals. And with what has happened, this means that this will have major implications of the export of minerals and especially issues of consumption by some of these world consumers. And strategically, what it means is that this will have an implication even on the taxations of countries. For example, there's going to be a stronger impact on profit-based taxes and a smaller impact somehow on output-based taxes such as royalties. And therefore, this is going to be really a depressing environment or scenario on the extractive industries in Southern Africa. And what the situation really is posing to the region is that there's lack of diversified economies, where you find that the mining sector is the major economic sector towards the contribution of the national budget. And with these shocks that the sector is facing, it will mean that the impact is going to be even much more greater. And I think it is really a point of critical thinking to assess what then do we learn from this crisis going forward as a region in terms of the lack of diversification of our economies and really putting all our thoughts and efforts towards one sector despite its importance. And what we've also seen is that despite the region being very key in terms of producing key minerals and metals that are of major importance to the global economy, what we see is that there's been lack of preparedness and response mechanisms by the states within the SADC region, particularly in terms of addressing the COVID-19. And despite the extractive sector being a major source of domestic resource mobilization, we have seen most governments not really being prepared to address, to deal with this crisis. I think it's not just African countries. I think this has been a global concern, but you start questioning whereby, for example, some countries have set up solidarity funds, for example, in South Africa, DRC, where the government has appealed to even other private individuals and even the sector to contribute towards this fight. And commendably, we have seen mining companies rising to the occasion in terms of really putting resources towards complementing the efforts of the government. But you find in some cases, there are countries that have not even been able to set up solidarity funds where they've initially invested as the government towards the fight, whereby they are mainly relying on donations. And whilst the mining companies have really stepped up, I think what's also critical for us is that African governments, especially the SADC countries, need to really critically think about how do they take forward the sector towards disaster risk reduction and emergency response mechanisms, learning from what we've seen from the COVID-19. And we have seen that mining companies are much more, are really investing a lot of money in terms of the funds towards helping governments to complement. But more so, I think the efforts of the mining companies have been much more open and towards the operations within communities within their operations, which is something that is really commendable to note. But I think what also needs to be done is to have governments really stepping to the fore and really leading by example. And maybe in terms of my closing, I'll just say that I think it's really a time of critical thinking whereby there is need for the SADC governments to rethink their socio-economic priorities and formulating critical national strategies that effectively use the extractive industries. And we do have a lot of regional, continental, international frameworks that have been developed. And I think this is now the time, based on what we have seen on the ground and the importance of the sector in terms of fight towards broad-based social economic development. And it's also, there's also need for the extractive industries itself, the companies, to also really start thinking, how do they operate under this new normal and rise to the occasion based on the importance of this sector towards the region. I think those would be my few highlights in terms of what the report is all about.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for these very, very in-depth points on the reports. We will come to comment on them during the session. Now I invite Mthwalo Msoni from Zambia to make his presentation. Mthwalo?
Hi everyone, sorry I had problems connecting to the webinar, but I listened keenly on Vero's presentation and I hope I won't be absolutely repetitive when it comes to the points that I want to put across, seeing that lots of discussions have been done. Basically, for me, speaking to the case of Zambia, my name is Mthwalo Msoni. I used to coordinate Publish What You Pay in Zambia till 3 months ago. I'm now a global tax advisor with ActionAid. The first point that I want to put across, and I'm hoping you're able to see my screen, is the extractive sector's contribution in Zambia. So if you look at how big the extractive sector is in Zambia, you'll see that it contributes 80% in terms of the total export value. 29% of total government revenue comes from the extractive sector. 10% of GDP in Zambia is attributed to extractive sector, and it significantly contributes 2% to the total employment. If you look at what is actually extracted in Zambia, the majority of the commodity that's extracted is copper. And the copper that is extracted in Zambia is followed by, in terms of production value, gold, then coal, we have lots of emeralds, limestone, and so on and so forth. It's important to note that in Zambia, in terms of the exports that we have for copper, not all the copper is actually extracted in Zambia. And you can see from the screen to say that the export quantity here is
Ntwalo, we
significant.
can't see your screen.
Oops. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Now,
Yes, we are seeing. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So if you look at in terms of the quantity of copper that's exported, you would see here where I have my mouse to say there's actually more copper that's exported in Zambia than what is extracted. And I'm emphasizing on this point because it's important to take note of this as we look at what Zambia has been doing to mitigate the extractive sector from the impact of the COVID. So we export large quantities of copper and also quite large quantities of cobalt. As you can see on the table that you have, should be on the left of your screen. We don't extract significant quantities of cobalt, but we extract lots of cobalt and much more copper because we import concentrates from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Zambia has also a growing extractive, a gold extraction going on. And of late, we've been producing quite significant amounts in terms of gold, of which, as I mentioned earlier, not all the gold is that is extracted is actually exported because some of it is demanded locally. So looking at the two commodities which we predominantly extract, and of course, we also produce significant cobalt from the concentrate we extract from the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you look at your screen, it's actually showing you what's been happening to the copper prices in the cobalt times. And highlighting here to compare what's happening during the COVID times and the global economic crisis. So you can see that there's been a significant decline in copper prices, copper which is in green, and for gold, there's been actually an increase in the price of gold. Gold is being used as a safe haven for most investors. So the demand, the global demand for gold and the price for gold has significantly increased, while the price of copper has significantly decreased. But then it's important to note that the decline in the price of copper during COVID times can be likened to the price of copper when we came to 2016, and is significantly higher than it was in 2008. The impact of the extractive sector on the economy, the biggest impact, of course, is in terms of the revenue projections that were expected to be collected from the extractive sector. Being predominantly a copper mining country with lots of copper mining companies contributing to the tax, we're expected to lose about 14.8 billion kwacha in terms of revenues, of which 80% of these losses are expected to come from the extractive sector. To contextualize this, the budget of Zambia for the education sector was 13.1 billion. The whole budget, the whole money that we're going to spend on education. And you can already see that the revenue losses that have been projected from COVID times, of which 80% of this is coming from the extractive sector, is way higher than the 13.1 billion, which at the beginning of the year and end of last year, we actually complained that we can actually spend more on education. Continuing on the impacts, what we've noted is that there are some mining companies like the Glencore-owned Mopani copper mines, citing COVID as one of the reasons why they had to shut down. And this resulted into some form of standoff between the government and the company, because the government believed that the decline in copper prices was not significant enough for them to justify the shutdown. So there have been discussions, and currently what's happening is the mining company has resumed operations, but has still filed in a 90 days notice to say they're going to shut down. And amongst the reasons they're talking about low copper prices. This has also a large implication in terms of the labor force. This particular mine employs 11,000 people. So you can imagine that if it was to totally close down, 11,000 jobs would actually be lost. The mining industry in Zambia has also been calling for lots of incentives because for them, the argument is there are low prices now, there's difficulties with the supply chain, and the sector is struggling. The measures that have been taken by government, specifically responding to the difficult times that the mining companies say that they're currently going through, is first of all, the removal of a statutory instrument 90, which is talking about the claims on value-added tax on import of spare parts and lubricants, which compose most of the imports by mining companies. There's been a suspension on the import duties on concentrates. Remember, I earlier talked about Zambia exporting way more copper than it produces because we import lots of concentrates from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and these concentrates actually attracted import duties. So now there's a suspension in order to meet the production capacity of the smelters. There's a suspension of export duties on precious metals and crocodile skin. This is a questionable measure looking at the way gold price is actually going high, and lots of revenue can actually be generated from gold in this time. So, but then government has actually suspended export duty on precious metals like gold, which means that now there's an incentive in the export of gold. Government has also lifted penalties and interest on delayed tax payments because of COVID. So now if you're going to cite COVID as the reason why you didn't pay your tax or you are not paying your tax at a particular time, it won't attract penalties and interest. So basically what I've been speaking to is what you can see on your right side. So these are measures that were taken in terms of the 2019 changes to the tax regime, which introduced export duties on precious metals like gold, which is actually doing very well now at 15%, and import duties on copper and cobalt concentrates at 5%. So these two measures have been reduced. And in terms of the taxes, and particularly on royalties, you can actually see that most of these have been maintained post-COVID. One argument that we can actually have, reflecting on some of the measures that have been taken and reflecting of how the sector has actually performed, is the importance of progressive taxes. Zambia recently introduced progressive taxes in terms of royalties. And what you can see on your left is a depiction of the progressive taxes we had. So in 2019, you can actually see that in the beginning of the year, when copper prices were about 6,100 US dollars per ton, would actually get 7.5% in terms of the royalties. But now, with copper prices reducing to about 4,100 per ton, we're actually looking at getting 4%. So if this was spread across other metals like cobalt, like gold, you'd actually see that there wouldn't be more need to give incentives to mining companies because the tax liability would actually have been reduced. And the last point I just stressed on speaks to my first recommendation. The issue of progressive taxation, the issue of uncertainty in terms of the extractive sector is not a new discussion and is not new to the African continent. There have been lots of periods like this, and there are going to be lots of periods where these minerals, metals, this oil is going to boom. And the African mining vision, which I believe PWYP has been calling for domestication, actually speaks to these issues of having a progressive tax regime. So a progressive tax regime, usually you have automatic triggers which talk about how much tax needs to be collected in terms of the extractive sector. Another recommendation that I can speak to in terms of the happenings across Eastern and Southern Africa is governments need to refrain from income tax holidays, and there's a huge temptation to actually give income tax holidays. Income tax is only paid if a company is actually making profit. So it doesn't make sense for you to actually go into giving an incentive on income tax when a company is struggling and will not make profit either way. So things that can actually be considered and need to be considered thoroughly. I believe the IGF and the Africa Administrative Tax Framework has actually produced a brief on this, would be probably VAT reliefs or deferred payments in terms of things like royalties in order to maintain the cash flows for extractive companies. Because of shortfalls in terms of budgets, governments need to also closely consider barter agreements. And by closely considering, it's about trying to value how much the extractive sector can actually invest in the health or sacrifice some of the hospitals and healthcare equipment to the fight against COVID. They can claim this as expenditure and actually pay less taxes if need be, if things get to the worst. We know lots of extractive companies have actually their own health facilities, which would be helpful during this time. And if we go this route, there will be need to actually look closely at the cost and evaluate it as they would want to claim this out of the expenditure. And lastly, I think relief and suspension of penalties need only be given to companies, extractive companies that have a good record in terms of tax compliance. And this also speaks to the importance of our tax administrations to actually reflect upon their administrative capacity to collect most of these taxes. We already know that in Africa and most countries in Eastern and Southern Africa have a challenge with collecting income taxes. Corporate income tax is usually very low, if at all collected. So we need them to also reflect upon this thing, because this time around, they cannot only rely upon the taxes on production. I think that's what I had to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mtwalo. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for these very brilliant presentations. We will move very fast to the questions. And I saw 3 hands, but one of those hands disappeared from the chat. So I will, before I give words to some of them, I will make some questions. There is one question from Zimbabwe, asking that Mukasiri's presentation is missing the human element. Can you share how this affects the communities and affected by extractives, especially women? The other question is about the government, Zimbabwean government efforts to join EITI and OGP. Mukasiri can answer this question. The other question is for Rachel, asking what are the efforts being done by the Tanzanian government on supporting or to support small artisanal mining so they can be able to cope with the situation caused by COVID. The other question from Irene is about what recommendations can be made to ensure countries effectively harness revenues from extractive industry towards recovery of the economy. Irene is from Kenya. We have also a question about from Evan Rubara, asking, I will read his comment. He said that you are quite right, Irene. I'm just wondering why some of the governments in African landscape seem to lag behind in coming up with strategies to salvage economy in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. Since we are talking about the extractives, how can the economy loopholes created by the pandemic on the sector be blocked? What is this panel advice to the government in resource-rich countries in Africa? There is a question regarding to EITI and small artisanal mining. The question is to Rachel, how will this gender lens that Rachel pointed out and the design of fiscal stimulus be mainstreamed into all regions in Africa? Will civil society be consulted as they work very closely with women and mine host communities? Veronica, South Africa has been working on a 10-point plan for safety in operations. Can you elaborate more on this? So I said that I have a hands from Nelly. So it's the only hand I could point because the other ones get off. So Nelly, may you make your question? And if there is someone else who wants to make a question, just raise your hand so we will be able to see you. Nelly, please.
I think, I don't know why it appears to be me, but the questions I see, if I'm not mistaken, those who raise their hands, some of our questions have been asked in the Q&A. I don't know if you've seen that one, Fatima.
Yeah.
There is a Q&A button there. So
yeah. So
I don't know if the hands that were raised. Okay.
Yeah, Tafazwa raised the hand. Please, Tafazwa, move on. So we will come back to the questions in Q&A. Tafazwa. So let me unmute Tafazwa. Tafazwa. Yes, so I
can help
trying
there.
to speak. Tafazwa, yes. Please help because I cannot take her.
Tafazwa, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah. Yes, hello. Please move on.
Good afternoon, how are you?
Good, thank you. What about you?
No, I'm doing quite well. I would like to thank the panelists for their submissions. I just wanted to make 2 comments. I've noted that in Zimbabwean context, the mining companies were giving donations to the office of the president for COVID-19 relief, but this was not replicated at the local level where the mining companies are situated. Is a cause for concern. I'm not so sure if this applies to the Zimbabwean context or it's an African problem. So there is need for citizens to hold these mining companies, not to just pay this token of PR by providing basic goods to the president, but they should start at the bottom, because we get reports from the communities that they don't have enough food, that especially for women, we've got limited access to reproductive health services. So in essence, mining companies need to do these acts of charity where those natural resources are. So that's one comment. And then the other one, Madam Chair, has to do with the way African countries are lobbying for debt cancellation. So, that argument, extractive industries vis-a-vis the debt relief person is missing. Maybe I might have missed it due to connectivity issues, but how do we then bring that argument to say we're not going to mortgage our natural resources for debt payment? And African countries should not take new loans in order to finance COVID-19 responses in exchange for mortgaging of their natural resources. But otherwise, the discussions were very interesting. I keep up the good work. I hope we'll be able to get the PowerPoint presentations. Asante sana.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nelly, someone else online? I think no. So I will ask the panelists to answer the questions in Q&A. There is Miley's Litvinov question from PWYP UK asking about intergenerational equity. That is do people talk about whether generation now alive should invest receipts from extraction or non-renewable resources in long-lasting financial and social assets for the benefits of future generation, or is there mainly an emphasis on the urgent development needs of present generation and not much discussion about what future needs? So the other question is from Brown, asking to those countries that have reserves bank, how are they countries protecting their economy and and the citizens. The other question is from Martin. Looking at the number of women in small scale mining, what recommendations can Publish What You Pay send to government in Africa? The other is from Muhumuza Didas asking about economy diversification, saying that this is just a song. Natural resources dependencies in Africa has always been risk and no one should blame COVID-19. What should be done to ensure a real move towards appropriate action rather than just talking and leaving it bare? Brown is insisting and asking if the speakers can share what are the measures put in place for operating mines, in particular for safety of workers who have to work in deep mining or underground mining. And also, can we also get an understanding of infection rates in presenters' countries? Is there a livelihood of manifestation of more illicit financial flows from the extractive sector during this period? This is a question of Regina. And the two last ones, Brown insisting, what has been a response of rating agents on your countries? Have you been downgraded? If not, why? What is your personal understanding on the role of these agents and relevance of play in their relevance on the play in the economy? Well, I think we should stop here and allow our guests to answer the questions, and then we will come back to another questions that will be raised during this conversation. So please, I don't know who would like to start. Veronica, Rachel, Mutwalo, and Mukasiri.
Yeah, sure, I can start. Thank you once again, Fatima, for good moderation and speakers plus the questions asked. I'll just go straight to some of the questions that have been asked, and from the Zoom Q&A, I think I've responded to one that was asking about the data that we had provided. But I just want to make it clear that overall in Tanzania, our GDP ranges from 12 to 13% of the total economy, and within that the extractive sector is contributing an average of 4.8 up to 5% of the total GDP, whereas now in computing of the amount of revenues that is being collected, it's only 1% of the extractive related revenue that is being contributed to government revenues in the country. Miles from Publish What You Pay asked about the question of intergenerational saving. It's unfortunate that within our oil and gas related laws, we have provisions for the establishment of the sovereign fund, which that was enacted since 2015, but until now, that fund has not been established. The case is also with the mining sector, and this is a bit critical because for Tanzania, we have been mining for more than 30 years, but there is no fund or proper legislation that is in place to establish a fund that will manage revenues that are accrued from the mining sector in Tanzania. So it is a bit challenging. As I said, most of our government fund is meant to provide for immediate basics, like social basics, like to provide for food, roads, what people need at this moment, but we don't have long savings that are put specific from the mining sector or petroleum sector. The question about how gender lens can be mainstreamed within the region, I think, again, within our governments, for instance, from Tanzania, there are no, if there is, but then they're very inadequate. There are no discussion that are looking at the gender aspect with the, within the extractive sector. And this could be very critical, the fact that now as Publish What You Pay, in the new strategic plan, gender is a center for discussion. So the fact that now we still have a missing gender and extractive discussion before even Corona, it makes even more difficult now to bring the gender discussion within the context of coronavirus disease. So there is need for all the civil society and like-minded organization and stakeholders within the sector, maybe to come up with joint research within the region and advocacy campaigns that could push for the need to address women risks within the pandemic, because in a total shutdown, for instance, in Tanzania, we all know that women constitute majority of our populations, and we have communities of women which are women-led but specific, and men tend to run away when there are difficult problems at home. So it still comes back to the burden of women to try and manage, first of all, if there are patients within their homes, they have to manage the patient. At the same time, they will have to provide for the family. So this is something that we could make it as a priority within the Publisher to Pay campaigns, to come up with joint statements and advocacy around women, mainstream advocacy with this thing.
Okay, thank you, Rachel.
Brown asked the question if
Rachel.
Yeah, one last question from Brown about measures that put in place, in particular for safety of workers. In Tanzania, particularly, is that mining companies, what they've done, they have put screening points plus isolation centers. But again, for us, our call is more about there are no mechanisms in place to try and prevent already vulnerable workers who already have prevailing conditions like pressure, diabetes, to try minimize their risks of further exposure to the pandemic. So these are some things, as I said, one of the recommendations is to try influence the government to amend workplace-related policies so that to advocate for workplace rights, especially preventing the risk of exposure for workers, but also trying to have mechanism in place to ensure those that with prevailing conditions, then they're well protected. At the same time, yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have 5 hands, Gloria, Robert, Martin, Evans, and Moses. So I will open up for Gloria right now, and then will be Robert afterwards, Martin, and then Evan and Moses. So Gloria, please don't give up. You will have the floor and make your comment or question. Please, Gloria.
I don't see Gloria. Is her hand still?
She was raising there, so I think she gave up afterwards.
No, I see her coming.
She was the first one. She was the first
Okay,
one.
so let me just let her speak.
Yes.
Gloria.
Yes.
Gloria, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Fatima, for not giving up on me.
You're welcome, darling.
So my question goes to any of the panelists. Great presentations, by the way. Thank you very much for those insights. I just wanted to ask if any of you have any available data on the risk levels for artisanal small-scale mining, considering that their transactions are primarily with cross-border traders. I don't know if there's been any data on that, and if there is any specific inclusion of these risks in the specific country response plans. I know, for example, in Malawi, we have a national response plan, but the sector is not included. It's not very, very clear in terms of how they can address the specific challenges, because you're looking at the closing of borders and restrictions on border accessibility, but then with the SM sector, then it's a bit more porous. So I don't know if there's been any measures, or if you have any suggestions in terms of what could be done to protect that particular group of miners. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. So now we open for Robert Baganda.
Yes, my question is about also vulnerable people, especially the small-scale miners and other vulnerable people who are employed in the extractive sector. I understand the funding institutions such as World Bank IMF, WHO is giving funding to solve the problem caused by COVID-19. I can say Uganda has so far, all of those institutions I've talked about have committed money, funding for Uganda to solve the problem of COVID-19. And we know that most of the money to repay the loans will come from extractives and people lose jobs. So are these funding institutions, for example, considering to make sure that part of that money will ensure that people who have their jobs in the extractive industry don't lose them? And also people, especially those vulnerable communities, can also access part of that money. Is there any guideline, especially to the vulnerable communities? My question goes to Veronica and any other person who can answer it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. So we move to Martin. Hi, Martin. We are listening to you. Please go ahead. Hi, Martin. Hi, Martin.
I think we go to another. The sound is really bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can move to Evans. And we will try to go back to Martin afterwards. Evans?
Yes, thank you very much for this great panel and the discussions. I think that one of the first questions I would like to ask in the midst of all the discussions we've had is, what is the end result of this panel? What kind of a message are we actually intending to come up with to our government, as well as strategically place ourselves as the civil society organizations to work side by side by our government on fighting COVID, but also giving advice on what could happen in the aftermath of COVID. This is really to all the panelists. The second, I've had a lot of talk about, the taxation, and the panelists have done a great job. Rachel has just touched the impact of COVID on ASM sector just by passing. ASM activities are not only in Tanzania, but within our countries, especially the countries which are presented here. I would have loved to hear a lot more from all the panelists on these issues. And particularly, I would have liked to hear a little more from Veronica Zano on what SARWatch is doing on highlighting the impact of COVID within the Southern African community countries, on the ASM sector. I have a lot more questions, but maybe I would leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Evans, for these questions. Moses?
Which Moses is that?
Is Moses
Shamitha?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Just
over there?
Yeah, you can talk now.
Yes, please, Moses.
Moses, you can unmute, I think. You should be able to unmute.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hi, Moses.
Yes, how are you? Thank you very much for this webinar, and I want to thank the panelists for insightful discussions. But my first question goes to Mtwalo Msoni. I've realized that in his recommendations, he has also recommended for some further tax reliefs for the extractive sector. But my worry is it a wise decision for governments to give in to the demands of companies in the mining sector for further tax reliefs or concessions, considering that in most cases in many countries, they are already enjoying generous concessions? Then my second question goes to any one of the panelists. How are governments and civil society organizations guarding against the risks of illicit financial flows from the extractive sector during these periods of COVID-19, and we understand a lot of things are happening, especially under the lockdowns, given that this sector is most vulnerable to such types of financial crimes that are eroding the tax base for the tax base in most African countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses. I think we don't have any other hands raised.
Yeah,
I
we're
don't
running
know
out of time, Fatima.
Okay, so we can move to the questions raised by the participants that I read some of them, but there is one that I think would be really interesting to answer to it, which is related to these donations. If these, which was by a participant from Madagascar, but I will allow another participant, another panelist, Tualo, Kasiri and Veronica, to answer the questions, and according to the time available, if you can cover the maximum you can, please, we will be very grateful. So who will start? We'll start Mukasiri, Veronica, who wants?
All right, let me quickly give it a go. To start with, there is a question about what Zimbabwe is doing to join EITI or the Open Governance Partnership. I think I highlighted earlier on that over the past decade, we've been going in circles. So there's virtually no political will when it comes to promoting an open and accountable governance of the extractive sector. Then secondly, there was also a comment in terms of donations that are made to by mining companies to the office of the president without any action that is on the ground. We need to be very specific. I want to give an example of one of the largest gold mining companies that is operating in Zimbabwe, called the Blanket Mine. It's according to its policy and its pronouncement is that they are donating at least 5 million Zimbabwean dollars weekly to local efforts for the community in Gwanda and surrounding areas in Bulawayo to contribute to the COVID response pandemic. And equally so, Unki Mine also made some donations that are targeting the Gweru, the provincial center, which is where it is close to. So I'm saying it's on case-by-case basis, but broadly, most of the donations that have been made by mining companies have been channeled to the Chamber of Mines. Then there is also the issue of the COVID impact in terms of the human factor. Let me be very clear. For me, I don't think COVID should cloud the discussion that we are having. For Zimbabwe, I would want to give an example. Our health system, there were no doctors, no drugs, nurses on strike and not working. That's a disaster. If you look at the ASM sector, I read about something about Sierra Leone where about more than 20 people died from a collapse of a pit. And in Zimbabwe, such disasters are always occurring in the ASM sector. We have got other diseases that are there, tuberculosis, STI, HIV, and so forth. So all I'm trying to say is we need not to be sidetracked. Of course, Corona is a big issue, but it's just a wake-up call to the broader disconnect between the way our resources are extracted and sustainable local economic and social development indicators, which are pointing to a different direction. Yeah, so that's, I think, what I would say. Then lastly, when it comes to the impact, again, of COVID on ASM, the impact is not only in terms of only the transmission of the disease itself, but also what is hitting countries like Zimbabwe is, for instance, the supply chain disruptions. As you know, the ASM sector work with very thin capital, therefore no capital, working capital at all. So they want to buy constantly the goods and services, explosives, diesel. So with these disruptions that are taking place and the cost rent-seeking behavior of seeking by the police of trying to move from one point to another, it has also burdened them with the cost. And the second aspect of it is that the prices themselves, where the black market appears to have been paying better prices, but because of these disruptions, the price per gram is about $50. In some places, they're paying $32 US, some is $42 US. So you can see that the impact is not only on the disease itself, but in terms of the health, but also the economic disease, as in terms of depressing the productivity and profitability of the sector.
Thank you, Mukasiri. So we can move, we will end up with Veronica. So we will move to Mtwalo.
Thanks, Moses, for the question. So I'll respond to both the questions you had because they pertain to taxation. And I think the one on illicit financial flows also broadly speaks to what Regina had asked. So in my presentation, I think I specifically mentioned to say incentives on income need to be avoided. And if at all an incentive is going to come through, it's supposed to be targeted at an already existing mine that has met a criteria of having a set of indicators that would actually show you that they're actually undergoing the negative impacts of the COVID. The IGF and ATAF produced a set of recommendations that would actually be used as an indicator to say a company would actually be in need of relief. And I think on top of my head, I can pick on a few things that you'd want to look out for if you're going to consider an incentive, which would probably a negative cash flow. A negative cash flow, if a company is at risk of laying off a significant number of workers, there's a sharp drop in the price of the commodity that the company is dealing with. If a company has been closed for quarantine, for example, they still have to pay their workers, but at the same time, they're not producing, which would lead to a negative cash flow. And if they can't meet their debt obligation. So these are some of the indicators that you would need to look at. And specifically, none of these should look at the income tax side, and none of these should look at new companies that are coming in, only existing ones, and if they have actually met this criteria. And it's worth mentioning that these measures would only from my perspective, be applicable to those that are into oil extraction. Because if you look at the demand for metals and minerals, there hasn't been that of a sharp decline as compared to oil and gas. So most of these incentives would actually apply to those that are into oil extraction as opposed to commodities. And broadly, just respond to the aspect of the risk of illicit financial flows in this time. It's also prudent for governments to take note of the measures that have been put in place and to what extent they're being used by companies during this period to avoid abuses. And from the recommendations that have also come from other institutions that have looked closely into this, the issue of administrative capacity to collect taxes, to audit, and to actually assess the tax liability comes as a top priority. So it should not be left to just the companies to make use of some of the relief that has been given, but administrative institutions, tax administrative institutions, should also take it upon themselves to continue auditing, looking through the books of these extractive companies to understand what's going on. Already in Zambia, there was a discussion to say the lifting of import duty on concentrates would warrant mining companies to probably enter into future contracts for supply at a non-taxable rate, and it would create problems for revenue collection. So these are part of the things that countries need to look closely at.
Okay, thank you. Veronica?
All right. Thank you, Fatima. I kind of first connection challenges at some point, so I'm not sure if I got all the questions. But before I left, the South Africa's, and for me, 10-point plan that is being developed by the mining industry in South Africa is being implemented by different ministries, particularly the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Employment. And this is basically efforts to ensure that the mining industry is done in a manner that safeguards the human element and provides safety, especially within the labor force as well as adjacent communities. And some of the efforts that are being championed under the 10-point plan within the mining industry is to address issues of employee retentions that are working on the mines, dealing with issues of COVID-19 cases that are found within the mining premises, also ensuring that there is use of medical facilities for the broader community around the mining operations beyond just the staff of the mining companies, and more so towards strengthening issues of preparedness by the mining companies themselves. So I think this is something that definitely can be a lesson for other countries within the SADC community, whereby it has been left maybe for the mining companies to develop health preparedness and safety within the mining areas. But I think this is a commendable strategic reaction by the South African government, whereby they need to be able to be the ones that dictate what strategic mining companies they have to put in place so that they comply with them, rather than leaving it to their own discretion on how to provide issues of safety within the mine workplace and so forth. Then secondly, I do agree with regards, I think there was an appeal that I think as SARWA, what are we doing in terms of addressing issues of the COVID-19 on the ASM sector and broadly even the IFFs within the sector. And I do agree with Mukasiri that I think the discourse is just not within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you look at the issues that even the panelists and even the participants have been raising, it's more of the broader governance issues we've been battling with in this sector. And this is now the time whereby it's a checkmate. Whereby the COVID-19 has just been that process that needs to issues. So I think there are critical issues that have been raised in further research areas that we need to do as civil society, working in the sector to promote transparency and accountability, particularly issues of data and development and this link, as well as issues of transparency and accountability in some of these solidarity funds or issues of strategies that are being used in terms of advancing and fighting the virus, as well as these issues of broadly understanding what the ASM sector is. But for me, I think with the ASM sector, the issues of lack of formalization brings in more of the discourse that the lack of formalization is presented as problems by most countries within the SADC region. And for us, we have actually finalize the study where we're looking at the political economy that could have implications right now, even with the link with what's going on the issues of how the lack of formalization presents as the ASM as a subsector that is going to be prone to further leakages and revenue leakages within the treasury funds and so forth. So I think for us, it's more critical work is needed by civil society in terms of research and development towards the broader issues that we are facing, being showcased by the COVID-19. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we are running out of our time, so we will not be able to open up for more round of questions. We ask our panelists to answer the questions in Q&A. So please, we will be engaging those who made questions that were not answered. They will be answered very soon by our panelists. So in terms of concluding, I would like to say thank you so much to Veronica, to Mtwalo, to Rachel, And also we want to say thank you to Mukasiri for these very, very interesting presentations about the situation in their countries, and also bringing up more insights for further debates about the COVID impacts. I would like just to underline that this is important for civil society to look at the impact of COVID in terms of fiscal, because we know that some companies will be claiming a very high cost as regards to this situation, because some are producing and are not exporting. So this is deal with costs. And also some companies will be given some extra holidays. So all these issues should be carefully followed up, and the process must be transparent for us in order to know which kind of losses our countries will have regard or due to COVID impacts. Also, I'd like to bring a bit some low information about Mozambique. Mozambique is a country that is in a very crucial moment of exploration of its natural gas in Rovuma Basin. And the main project projected on $30 billion was postponed sine die. So we don't know where the final investment decision will be made, and this will have a very significant impact in future revenues for the state. The IMF said that this delay in the final investment decision can impact on future revenues in case on more than $1.5 billion for the state. And there is assessment saying that delays of a year in terms of construction of LNG projects is leading to a 40% of cost overrun. So this has a huge and significant impact on future revenues for the state. So because of COVID, some of the projects will delay. We have one LNG infrastructure being constructed in our country, but this was stopped for sine die. We don't know how long it will take due to COVID. Some countries like Angola, Ghana, Nigeria, for example, they will need to use some of their resources from their sovereign wealth funds, and it's important to this process to be transparent, how much they will take from their sovereign wealth fund to finance the needs to respond to COVID, and how transparent this use of these resources will be. And also IMF is granting some countries with a significant million of dollars, and this money will be paid in future. How do we as a civil society make sure that these payments will not be against future revenues, or the revenues, natural resources, the revenues will not be used to pay these debts? So there is a lot of challenges, and we as civil society has a lot to do in terms of monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on the performance of the sector in this moment. So I would like to thank you so much to PWYP family for inviting me to be the moderator of this session. And I would like to say my round of applause for all the panelists and all the participants in this session. Thank you so much for your comments and your questions. So I pass the word for Nelly for final remarks. Nelly, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for this honor.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you to all our panelists. It's unfortunate we can't clap loud enough for you, but we can at least say thank you on our chats for all the discussions and the panelists. I noticed that there are some questions that were asked in the Q&A that haven't been answered, or maybe somehow answered, but a few reflections for the panelists. Moses Kulaba had some questions for you. If you can take some time and have a conversation, I think we'll take it to our ESA WhatsApp chat group so that we can pick up the discussion from there. So maybe Moses Kulaba, you could post it on our WhatsApp group and nudge the panelists to respond, and we continue the conversation. So without getting people so fatigued out of all these webinars, we'll end here. But thank you so much to everybody. We really had hoped that the webinar will be a a sort of platform for us to deliberate as civil society organizations. Someone was asking what happens after here. And so we are thinking that we would compile, a small statement communique from some of the discussions that have come out of here. We'll probably also write a blog and share some of the thoughts and proposals that have been picked out of here, and try and sort of share across our different regions and policymakers, even in country, on some of the issues that are coming out and generated out of this discussion. But hopefully then we can organize a follow-up discussion with some other policymakers across the two different, East and Southern Africa, to see if we can channel some of our issues that we've raised here to be taken to that level, because, decisions are being made even during this season that affect many of our communities, many of our sectors where we are working. So I thank you all for taking time to join us today. We'll get the presentations from the panelists and share with all of you. But thank you so much. The recording as well, for those who may have missed out, or maybe the others who didn't make it and you want to share it with them, we'll share the recording once we've got that sorted. But thank you so much. Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, all the panelists. We're sorry, Gad, you were not able to sort of, I don't know what happened to the connection, but I think you listened to the most part of it. But there are so many opportunities for us to discuss. Of course, in the current situation, we can only do it virtually, but hopefully we can see each other in the coming months when things are settled. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, a good morning. Bye, everybody.